Just hours before a historic White House summit with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Donald Trump dropped a political bombshell. In a fiery statement, Trump told Zelensky that if Ukraine truly wants peace, it must give up on ever-reclaiming Crimea and abandon its dream of joining NATO. The comments come as Russian missiles continue to pound Ukrainian cities and European leaders gather in Washington to push for unity. Is Trump's demand a bold path to peace, or a dangerous concession to Moscow? Tonight, we break down what really happened, what it means for Ukraine, for Europe, and for America's role in the world. In a dramatic twist that has sent ripples across global politics, U.S. President Donald Trump declared on August 18, 2025, that Ukraine must abandon its aspirations to reclaim Crimea and give up on joining NATO if it truly wishes to end the devastating war with Russia. The statement, delivered just hours before Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was scheduled to meet Trump and a host of European leaders at the White House, set the stage for one of the most consequential diplomatic confrontations of the modern era. Trump's comments not only inflamed tensions between Washington and Kyiv, but also exposed deep fissures between the United States, its European allies, and Ukraine itself over how to chart a path toward peace in a conflict that has dragged on for more than 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion began. The timing of Trump's message was calculated and deliberate. Just days earlier, he had met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska in a summit that sidelined many of America's traditional allies. That meeting raised suspicions across Europe that Trump was prepared to pursue a bilateral arrangement with Moscow at the expense of Ukraine's sovereignty and Europe's security. Against that backdrop, his words directed at Zelensky carried a stark message. Peace, in Trump's vision, could come almost immediately if Kyiv was willing to concede two of its most cherished goals, the restoration of Crimea and membership in NATO. On his Truth Social platform, Trump wrote bluntly, "No getting back Obama-given Crimea, 12 years ago, without a shot being fired, and no going into NATO by Ukraine." For Trump, the formula was simple: concede on these 2 points and Russia would no longer have a reason to continue fighting. For Ukraine and its European supporters, however, the implications were profoundly destabilizing. The White House summit itself was designed to be a landmark gathering. Beyond Trump and Zelensky, attendees included French President Emmanuel Macron, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, Finnish President Alexander Stubb, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. The optics of unity were meant to send a strong message to Moscow that the West remained committed to supporting Ukraine. Instead, Trump's pre-summit declaration shifted the narrative toward division and uncertainty, leaving Zelensky to navigate a high-stakes diplomatic minefield in Washington. At a moment when Russian missiles were raining down on Ukrainian cities, killing civilians in Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and elsewhere, the idea of rewarding Moscow with territorial concessions and halting Ukraine's NATO ambitions seemed not only politically toxic, but morally unacceptable. Zelensky wasted no time in responding. Upon arrival in Washington, he issued a pointed rebuttal, stressing that Russia was solely responsible for the war and that Ukraine would never accept preemptive territorial concessions. Russia must end this war. The war it started, he told reporters, adding that Ukraine's strength, combined with that of America and European allies, would compel Russia to real peace. He reminded observers that under Ukraine's constitution, any territorial concession, including recognition of Crimea as Russian, would require a national referendum, making Trump's proposed deal virtually impossible. Moreover, NATO membership has been enshrined as a strategic objective for Ukraine since 2019, giving it a constitutional and symbolic weight that cannot simply be brushed aside for the sake of expediency. For Zelensky, giving up on these goals would not just undermine his presidency but risk tearing apart the fabric of Ukrainian democracy itself. The human cost of the war underscored the urgency of the debate. On the very morning of Trump's comments, Russian missile strikes on Kharkiv killed multiple civilians, including children, while drone attacks on Zaporizhia left a 15-year-old boy dead and his family wounded. These tragedies highlighted what many Ukrainians see as the futility of negotiating from weakness. Moscow continues to escalate, striking civilians and infrastructure alike, even while diplomacy is ongoing. For Ukrainians, Trump's suggestion that the war could end immediately through concessions sounded less like a path to peace and more like a recipe for surrender. To the families burying their loved ones, the notion of abandoning Crimea, a region symbolically and historically tied to Ukraine, and shelving NATO membership in exchange for Russia's goodwill felt like a betrayal. For Europe, Trump's stance was equally alarming. European leaders have long walked a careful line, balancing robust military and financial support for Ukraine with the political realities of maintaining unity at home. NATO's open-door policy is seen as sacrosanct, and the precedent of accepting territorial conquest by force runs directly counter to the principles on which post-World War II European security was built. Leaders like Macron and Merz emphasized in private conversations that any peace deal must not reward Russian aggression. Instead, Europe has been exploring ways to offer Ukraine binding security guarantees short of full NATO membership, such as multilateral defense treaties, long-term arms commitments, and accelerated integration into the European Union. Trump's remarks, however, threaten to undercut those efforts by shifting the goalposts toward concessions that Moscow has demanded since the earliest days of the invasion. Strategically, Trump's comments represented a notable shift in U.S. policy. Earlier in his presidency, he had suggested focusing on an immediate ceasefire, freezing the conflict in place while longer-term negotiations unfolded. Now, he appeared to be pressing for a comprehensive peace arrangement that required Ukraine to make irreversible concessions. This evolution reflected both Trump's transactional view of foreign policy and his long-standing skepticism of NATO. For decades, Trump has argued that NATO is a burden on the United States and that Europe must shoulder more of its own defense. His suggestion that Ukraine be permanently excluded from NATO aligns with this worldview, even if it clashes with the commitments of previous U.S. administrations. Critics argue that such a position amounts to granting Russia veto power over NATO expansion, fundamentally altering the alliance's credibility. Ukraine's constitutional framework makes Trump's demands not only politically explosive but legally untenable. According to its laws, no Ukrainian president has the authority to surrender territory without a nationwide referendum, and polls consistently show overwhelming opposition to conceding Crimea or other occupied regions. Similarly, the pursuit of NATO membership has been written into Ukrainian law as a strategic objective, reflecting the country's deep desire to anchor itself in Western institutions. Even if Zelensky wanted to consider Trump's offer, he would face insurmountable legal and political barriers at home. The Ukrainian public, hardened by years of war and sacrifice, views concessions as dishonoring the memory of thousands of soldiers and civilians who have died defending the nation. This sentiment severely limits Kyiv's room to maneuver diplomatically. Beyond the legalities, the broader implications of Trump's message are profound. For Russia, the demand that Ukraine give up Crimea and NATO membership echoes Putin's maximalist goals, effectively validating Moscow's claims. Russian officials, though not yet formally commenting on Trump's statement, are likely to view it as a diplomatic victory, reinforcing their narrative that Western resolve is wavering. For Ukraine and Europe, however, the fear is that Trump's approach will embolden Moscow to push harder militarily, believing that Western unity can be fractured and that time is on Russia's side. Indeed, the surge in Russian missile and drone strikes just before the summit suggests that Moscow is eager to capitalize on political uncertainty to extract maximum advantage on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. At the White House, the agenda was set to revolve around two competing visions of peace. On one side, Trump advocates for a swift, concession-based settlement that he argues could end Europe's bloodiest war since World War II almost overnight. On the other, Zelensky and Europe push for a ceasefire first, followed by negotiations that preserve Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The chasm between these positions underscores the difficulty of finding common ground. For Trump, the calculus is transactional, end the war quickly, reduce U.S. military spending, and claim a historic peace deal. For Zelensky, the calculus is existential, preserve Ukraine as a sovereign nation, ensure its democratic future, and prevent a precedent that aggression pays. For Europe, the calculus is strategic. Maintain stability on the continent, uphold international law, and avoid emboldening Russia to threaten other nations. As the summit unfolded, it became clear that Trump's remarks had set the tone for a contentious series of discussions. European leaders privately worried that if Washington pressures Kyiv into concessions, Europe's own security commitments would be undermined. Macron and von der Leyen stressed that any alternative to NATO membership must come with ironclad guarantees to prevent Ukraine from being left vulnerable. Starmer and Merz warned that a deal at Ukraine's expense could fracture European unity, giving rise to populist movements that accuse governments of abandoning Kyiv. Meanwhile, Zelensky sought to rally support by highlighting Russia's ongoing atrocities, including the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. His argument was simple. How can peace be negotiated when Russia shows no willingness to stop killing innocents? The broader geopolitical ramifications cannot be overstated. If Ukraine were forced to concede Crimea and abandon NATO, it would send a message to other vulnerable states that great powers can redraw borders through force and intimidation. For Eastern Europe, particularly the Baltic states and Poland, this would represent a nightmare scenario, undermining confidence in NATO's collective defense and emboldening Moscow to test the alliance's resolve. For the United States, it risks signaling retreat from its role as the guarantor of the international order, a role it has played since the mid-20th century. For Russia, it would mark a triumph of coercion and patience, proving that persistence and aggression can ultimately bend adversaries to its will. In essence, the stakes extend far beyond Ukraine, touching on the future of global security itself. The clash of visions at the White House summit thus illustrates the complexities of peacemaking in an age of great power competition. Trump frames his position as pragmatic realism, designed to stop the bloodshed and prioritize American interests. Zelensky frames his position as moral and legal necessity, rooted in the defense of sovereignty and international law. Europe frames its position as strategic prudence, wary of rewarding aggression but equally wary of escalation. The problem, of course, is that these positions are not easily reconcilable. Each is shaped by domestic politics, historical memory, and divergent priorities. And while diplomats may search for creative formulas, such as long-term security guarantees, phased ceasefires, or temporary compromises, the fundamental question remains unresolved. Should Ukraine be asked to sacrifice parts of its sovereignty in the name of peace? What happens next will depend heavily on the outcome of this summit and the choices made in Washington. If Trump persists in pushing for concessions, Zelensky may find himself isolated, though Europe is likely to stand by him. If compromise is reached, such as delaying NATO membership while securing robust security guarantees, there may be room for a face-saving formula. Yet if the summit ends in deadlock, the war is likely to grind on, with Russia escalating and Ukraine resisting, and the international community struggling to hold together a coherent strategy. Either way, Trump's pre-summit remarks have already reshaped the diplomatic landscape, forcing all sides to confront the uncomfortable reality that peace, like war, comes with costs that not everyone is willing to pay.